Well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us this morning as we begin exploring the impacts of sea level rise on our communities and discuss potential strategies to reduce and manage the risks we face together. We are already experiencing flooding on sunny days with no storms on the horizon. The effects of rising seas are already lapping at our communities here in southern Marin. We're here today not to provide answers, but to share ideas and a framework for thinking about sea level rise adaptation. Planning for sea level rise begins at the local level with a conversation about where we live, what we value, and what our adaptation options may be. Today is the start of that conversation. We look forward to your thoughts and your participation in how to plan for our future. So, what's on the agenda for today? I hope everyone got an agenda. We're going to start with two films. They're very short, so don't worry. The first is a film that was shown at the UN Climate Summit called What's Possible. And the second film is called King Tides, that's going to bring us really local right here and see pictures of what we're all experiencing right now. We then have three presentations, which will provide background on our Southern Marin Sea Level Pilot Study project and also the findings of that study. We'll have a presentation that describes adaptation options, and then we'll have a presentation that introduces local assets and vulnerability maps, and a tabletop exercise that we're calling the Game of Floods. This game is not very much like Monopoly, but it may give you a very different perspective on whether you want to acquire Boardwalk. After the presentations, we'll go to the other side of the room, sort of behind the curtain, and we'll have an opportunity to engage with sea level rise in a more interactive way. So that's what we're doing. After we do all that, there'll be time for questions and comments and a little bit of conversation about next steps. So that's the overview. On the practical side of the world, the restrooms are right down at the end of the hall. There's a water fountain, and I think you all know where the exits are. So, if everybody's ready, we will tee up. The film.
One day, we will wake up to find that the energy that powers the alarm clock came from the breeze through the trees the night before. And we will go to work that morning riding the rays of the sun. It will light our cities and power our businesses. It will warm our homes and cool our workplaces. It will reduce sources of conflict and fuel our economies. It will connect us all. It won't scar the land or poison the seas. The food we eat will be good for our bodies and good for the planet. And the weather that day won't make us worry for tomorrow. There will be more jobs and less disease. The sea level will stop rising. And species will stop dying. The question is, how do we get to that day from where we are today? All 7.3 billion of us. We start by deciding that beyond our doubts and differences, such a day truly exists. And that is something each of us can do today. We can make today the day we stop thinking that the changes required to get there are impossible and beyond us, and start realizing that they are not only possible, but what the future requires of us. We must stop turning from the warnings of science and fear and denial, and instead turn toward the solutions and partnerships we need. We can make today the day we stop pointing at each other in blame and instead chart a new course together. We have never faced a crisis this big, but we have never had a better opportunity to solve it. We have everything we need to wake up to a different kind of world. We need our leaders to be brave and their choices to be bold. They will either remember us as the generation that destroyed its home, or the one that finally came to respect it. We have every reason in the world to act. We can't wait until tomorrow. This is our only home. You can choose today to make a world of difference.
King tides are the highest tides of the year, a naturally occurring phenomena caused by the sun and moon's gravitational forces. When combined with storm conditions, many coastal areas face extreme flooding. Tidal gauges in the San Francisco Bay, the oldest in the Western Hemisphere, show the oceans have risen about 8 inches over the last 100 years. New data suggest an acceleration in higher levels over the last 15 years may be due to climate change. By the year 2100, scientific predictions range from 20 to 55-inch rise in sea levels. These 7-foot king tides give a glimpse of what daily tides may look like in the future and how they could affect parts of Marin.
So I wanted to combine those two films for you because to me they really encapsulate what's important for our communities, I think. On the one hand, it's looking and being aware of climate change on our global level. But it's looking at climate change in a way that's more productive and more positive and not giving up, but understanding that really the importance of starting this conversation now is having the time to really have a conversation, to take steps now that will make a change in our future. And also the importance of partnerships. Sea level rise, as we all know, if there was ever a problem that demands our collaboration, our cooperation, our partnership, our thinking outside of the box, our working together, and our being optimistic while recognizing challenges, That's the climate change challenge that we all face. But we can't just think on a global level. You know, many of us in our communities have had sort of an uncomfortable feeling about regional planning. So to me, sea level rise and climate change also has to start from the bottom up. And that's why I wanted to couple that first film with the second film about our king tides and the impact right here in our communities. Because as I'll talk a little bit more as I go through my presentation, we are the people who know our communities best. And if we're going to plan well for sea level rise, we need to start at our community level, at our local level, and then build outwards. No one of our communities acting alone can solve sea level rise, but we also can't plan well and come up with good solutions unless we know our localities well. So those two films for me really framed what I consider to be the most important issues and the way to frame our conversation here today. So I'm going to jump back just a little bit to the larger global perspective. This chart, as you'll see, goes to 2011. I think we can be confident that in 2014, global emissions of greenhouse gases have continued to rise. Many of us, many areas of the United States are attempting to make efforts. Certainly we are here in Marin and in the Bay Area to control our greenhouse gas emissions. Often, unfortunately, we don't do as well as we think we are. But efforts in countries around the world vary, and the trend is not positive. What started as a broad scientific consensus has really now become widely held understanding. The world around us is changing in profound ways, and as the Boy Scouts say, we need to be prepared. There we go. So here's a chart that I'm sure many of you have seen previously. This is observed sea level at the Golden Gate Bridge, taken from our sea gauges, and it shows that in the last 100 years, the frequency of extreme tides at the Golden Gate has increased 20-fold, and the sea level has risen by 8 inches. This obviously has important implications for flooding of homes, businesses, schools, and critical facilities, the erosion of our shorelines, the maintenance of our roads, the potential drowning of our wetlands and habitat areas, and impacts on our other assets. Some folks have called climate change a slow-moving emergency. And this is, in some ways, a positive thing because it gives us time to talk and converse and plan and prepare. But we have to start now. So this was what one might call, particularly if you're a sports fan, the doomsday scenario of what could happen to San Francisco if we do nothing. And I know after the recent Giants victory, nobody wants to get to this result. So if you didn't have a reason to start planning, I think now you do. So as we head into the next century, we may find that our shorelines are very much like they were in 1849. Climate change will have a profound impact on the San Francisco Bay. This includes droughts, altering freshwater flows and water use, and floods and sea level rise altering our landscapes and our own individual behavior. There will be effects on water supply and water resources, including reduction in available hydropower because of changes in the Sierra snowpack. There also potentially will be habitat and species loss, changes in our bird populations as wetlands change, ocean acidification, and the effect on oysters and other bay species population. You know, I tend to show these maps whenever I give a talk about sea level rise because I think it's such a profound statement about the changes that we have made to our San Francisco Bay Area through fill and development and the changes that could take those changes right back again if we really have the worst case scenario and the ultimate worst case impact of sea level rise. Another reason for us to start planning now as a regional level, not just as a locality, for how we want to deal with these potential impacts on our entire Bay Area. So some people say, well, what exactly is going to be the impact on people in the San Francisco Bay Area? And these are estimates that were developed by the state of California from medium to high greenhouse gas emission scenarios provided by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. These do not reflect the worst-case sea level rise that could occur. But looking at these numbers, it's pretty darn impressive without being the worst case. So as you can see, at 1 meter of sea level rise, potentially 220,000 people are at risk around the Bay Area. And the cost of replacing the infrastructure that was going to be underwater on the previous slide could be $49 billion. That's only at 1 meter. That's a little bit over 3 feet of sea level rise. If sea level rises 1.4 meters, which is a little less than 5 feet, there are 275,000 people at risk, and replacement costs go to $62 billion. These are numbers that I think sometimes cause us to just get paralyzed and stop talking. And that's not what we want to do, because essentially what this is the cost of doing nothing. And that's not what we want to do. What we want to do, as I've said before, is have the conversations now, see what we can do now. What steps can we take that will in fact moderate and reduce the impacts of sea level rise and reduce the risks and the costs going forward. So what should we do? As I said before, I think it's crucial that we start with understanding the impact to our community. And I hope everyone can see, I know there's a little bit of light on the screen, but obviously understanding the impact to our own community is very important. We want to recognize, as I said before, that we're all in this together. No one of us, no one town, no one neighborhood can solve this challenge. And we need to help work together to plan for our future, identifying our options and priorities. Those are things we're going to be talking about today. And then working together as neighborhoods, towns, counties, and Bay Area communities, keeping in mind we're all together at different levels of community. So here in Southern Marin, we've taken a first step, and we created the Southern Marin Sea Level Rise Pilot Study Project. The idea for this was, for me, inspired by the great work the BCDC has done in the East Bay in their Adapting to Rising Tides project, which took a stretch of land on the Alameda County shoreline from Emeryville to Union City, and really very closely in a sophisticated way examine the impacts of sea level rise and storm events in that area. So inspired by their project, we wanted to address 2 questions. First, how will the climate change impacts of sea level rise and storm events affect the future of Southern Marin communities, infrastructure, ecosystems, and economy? And second, what strategies can we pursue to reduce and manage those risks? So here's the study area that we selected. In many ways going forward, around Richardson Bay and Southern Marin may be ground zero for the impact of sea level rise. So we picked a study area that stretches from the sewage treatment plant in Mill Valley down along through Mill Valley, really looking at all the areas that touch on Richardson Bay. We incorporated the Redwoods, our one senior living facility in Southern Marin, and then continued on down along Shoreline Highway to Tam Valley in Southern Marin. I picked this area in some ways because it was large enough to be interesting and small enough to be manageable. But it's an important area for a couple of reasons in particular. The shoreline is diverse, and there's major highway infrastructure with State Highway 101, or that's actually US Highway, we think we own it, but it's a US Highway 101, and State Highway 1. And then, and particularly with Tam Valley and moving into Mill Valley and Marin City, we have a variety of public, private, commercial, and recreational assets. So it gave us a lot to think about. Plus, as you saw in the picture about king tides, these are areas where we're already feeling the effects of sea level rise. So, what we did first to launch this process and really start the local sea level rise adaptation planning process was to create a steering committee of local residents and business owners who have diverse experiences and diverse perspectives. None of us in the steering committee is a climate change expert, but we all have a good collaborative spirit. And we are extremely fortunate to have the support of extraordinary staff from a number of agencies. So I want to first go through, you'll see on the backside there is a list, the backside of your brochure, of the steering committee members and the staff and the advisors who have been helping us for the last year. but I want to run through their names. So the steering committee members included Josh Barrow, who's a resident of Marin City and serves on the Sausalito Marin City School District Board and is a financial services professional. Kevin Conger, who lives in Tam Valley, a landscape architect and founding partner of CMG Landscape Architecture. Phyllis Faber, a Mill Valley resident, biologist, environmentalist, and co-founder of Marin Agricultural Land Trust, or MALT. Cliff Fagallo lives in Mill Valley, an information services and technology professional. Hart Fogel, Mill Valley resident, a high school student, and a Marin County Youth Commissioner. When we first started, we had a second high school student, but he had the nerve to graduate. Went off to college, so we lost that input. Doreen Gennard, who lives in Galilee Harbor and is a harbor administrator. Elizabeth Graham, a resident of the Redwoods and a member of Seniors for Peace. Will Hutchinson, the owner of the Proof Lab Surf Shop in Tam Valley. Vicki Nichols, a Sausalito resident and a member of the Marin Environmental Forum. Anna Pletcher, a resident of Tam Valley and an attorney for the U.S. Department of Justice and the chair of our Marin County Women's Commission. And Steve Price from Commodore Marina. So we had a great group of people. And then fortunately, we had an even better group of staff and advisors to help us, including my two aides, Leslie Alden and Maureen Parton. We had a number of great staff from the Marin County Community Development Agency, Brian Crawford, the director of that agency, Jack Liebster, Dana Armanino, and Alex Westhoff. We also got the Marin County Department of Public Works Water Resources Group involved with the help of Tracy Clay, Roger Leventhal, and Liz Lewis. And fortunately, we got staff at BCDC to help us out as well. And so Lindy Lowe, Wendy Goodfriend, and Sarah Richmond have been invaluable helping us. And then we had some ringers from outside those particular agencies, including Liz Ranieri, who is an architect who was the winner of one of the 6 projects that was selected for an award for BCDC about 6 years ago when they did a contest for who can design some fantastically imaginative and creative structure to deal with sea level rise in San Francisco Bay. So that was Liz. We also have Dr. Christina Hill from UC Berkeley, who you'll be hearing from later today. Sandy Wallenstein from Green Up Learning to help us with getting the message out. Hannah Duress, Earth Day Marin. Gary Lyon from our Mill Valley City Council, and Rebecca Sunter for CMG Landscape Architecture. So really, it takes a village to even start a conversation about sea level rise, and it takes a partnership, and it will take a partnership of all of us and all of our many agencies going forward to really plan well and figure out what we want to do about sea level rise. So, the steering committee spent the last year cataloging and mapping assets in the study area, assessing the vulnerability of assets to sea level rise and storm events, learning about possible adaptation strategies, and developing the presentation materials and the tabletop exercise, our Game of Floods, that you will engage with today. This slide shows a framework for thinking about sea level rise adaptation. So starting at the top, it begins with mapping our sea level rise exposure in our local areas. You then move on to identifying the assets, assessing the vulnerability of those assets, evaluating the different adaptation strategies that might be appropriate, and planning for the adaptation options you want to take. Now, this is really a repeating cycle as we gain better knowledge and experience and monitor how steps we've taken, how effective they are, and we adjust what we may want to do as the conditions around us change. So keep these steps in mind as we go forward. So the first thing that you do is map assets. And here's an example of the kind of mapping that can be done for the effect of sea level rise in our neighborhoods. And it may be a little bit hard to read, but what this shows in different colors is the impact of 1 foot, 3 feet, and 5 feet of sea level rise in the northern part of our study area. This map shows the similar 1 foot, 3 foot, and 5 foot impact of sea level rise in the southern part of the study area. Don't think you have to memorize these maps because we got plenty more maps that everybody will be working with later in the presentation. But do keep in mind that with sea level rise comes higher tides and shifts in the tidal range, and frequent and permanent inundation of areas that are not currently affected by daily tides. Changes in wave activity may lead to increased shoreline erosion and waves overtopping shoreline protection. Higher bay water level leads to elevated groundwater and salinity. And more frequent storm events results in more frequent flooding and flooding that lasts longer. So there's many of these additional phenomena that it's good to keep in mind as we're thinking through our assets and our adaptation strategies. The second step in the sea level rise adaptation process is determining what our assets are in our locality. And so I'm going to go through a couple of slides here that just give you a quick pictorial overview of what's out there in our community. This first slide shows our schools, homes, and community centers that are located in the study area. We also have businesses and other kinds of community resources, all of which may be subject to the impact of sea level rise. And we obviously have roads, public transportation, public safety facilities. We have our emergency grid. Often it's easy to forget about those power of electricity towers out there and what's embedded underground. We have SASM, the wastewater treatment plant, and other critical infrastructure that are all located in this study area. And we have, obviously, our wetlands and Bothene Marsh, our marshes and mudflats that provide habitat for many of our wonderful wildlife, including some of our endangered species. And finally, we have our parks, beaches, shorelines, trails, and bike paths, all assets that I think all of us consider very important for our community, and all of which may be impacted by sea level rise. So once we've identified those assets, the next step in the process is to consider what is the vulnerability of those assets to sea level rise. By understanding the vulnerability of the assets, we can understand our community's capacity to cope with sea level rise impacts, both now, this picture I think was taken in 2012 of king tide flooding, and also into the future. When you're assessing vulnerability of an asset, you look at three things. The first is exposure, which means the extent to which an asset will be exposed to sea level rise. The second is sensitivity of that asset. If the asset is exposed to sea level rise, can its function, whatever that may be, depending on the kind of asset, be restored quickly, easily, or inexpensively? And the third thing you look at is adaptive capacity, which means the ability of the asset to adjust to the impact of sea level rise and maintain its primary function. Really what we're trying to understand through this vulnerability analysis is what is the magnitude of the expected consequences of sea level rise for each of those assets that we went through on the preceding slides. So this is the exercise that our steering committee has been engaged in. And we identified 8 categories of vulnerabilities in our study area. The first 2 categories, residential and commercial. Residential includes Tam Valley, and particularly the area that many of us call birdland, that's in a floodplain. The houseboat community at Waldo Point Harbor is actually also a vulnerable community. You might think, well, it's a houseboat, it's going to float. What's the problem? Houseboats obviously are connected by infrastructure to land, and that connection will be jeopardized as sea levels rise. And then the Redwoods, our only senior living facility in southern Marin, is right in the area of inundation from sea level rise. There are commercial areas in the study area we're all aware of. Shoreline Highway between Tennessee Valley Road and Tam Junction, primary commercial area. And the Pohono-Manzanita area as well has businesses, office building, other commercial enterprises that will be impacted. 2 other aspects, sort of categories of vulnerability. The first is vulnerable populations. And thinking through populations, who is vulnerable? Well, it may include people with limited mobility, seniors over the age of 75. We're assuming that those of us who are not yet 75 are very spry, and we're going to be fine. Those individuals who are linguistically isolated, households with no vehicles, and some low-income populations may be particularly vulnerable in sea level rise impacts. So in our study area, we said, well, what have we got? We have in Marin City, we have public housing and senior disabled housing. This is housing that will not be subject to flooding, but as you look more carefully at the inundation maps, you'll see that that community will be entirely cut off with the flooding of the Sausalito exit at 101. The Fireside Senior Family Housing, similar situation there. The housing itself may not be inundated, but you won't be able to get anywhere from that housing. And for senior populations, for families with children, that obviously raises significant challenges. Other vulnerable populations in the study area are located at Bridge Housing on Miller Avenue that is going to get its feet wet, and the Redwoods, which is also going to be a little bit damp. Public safety is another category of vulnerable assets. There's the fire and sheriff substation in Marin City. Again, this is an example of a structure that will not be wet, but our fire trucks, our sheriff's folks won't be able to actually get anywhere unless maybe they get those elevated vehicles that can get through the flooding at 101 and the exit in Sausalito, and also the flooding on 1 and coming up further north. We also have emergency shelters in our communities in different locations at schools and community centers. So these are facilities that may be particularly sensitive to sea level rise and are important assets in our community. Other categories of vulnerabilities, utilities and infrastructure. You saw on the pictures that we went through before, the Sewer Agency of Southern Marin. Our flood zone pump stations are something that we want to be very aware of, and the impact of sea level rise on the pumps that we're already relying on in some areas in Tam Valley in particular, and will be key for maintaining our ability to address sea level rise going forward. Gas and electrical utility lines, what's the impact on them going to be? And then our communications, we often forget about our cell phones, optic fiber telephone system that are all potentially vulnerable to climate change. And transportation, as I mentioned before, our roadways, we need to be aware of the impact of sea level rise on them. Finally, our last two categories that we identified, and these are not necessarily exclusive. During the course of the day-to-day, you may have ideas about other categories of vulnerabilities that we want to add to our list. But our final two categories are our natural habitat, Bothene Marsh, Coyote Creek, Upper Richardson Bay, and our recreation assets, the Mill Valley Sausalito Multi-Use Path, the Tennessee Valley Pathway, and then access to Muir Woods, the GGNRA, and West Marin. When Highway 1 floods, it won't be quite so easy to get to Muir Woods. So, now that we're worried, what are we going to talk about? So the next step in adaptation planning is to consider our adaptation options, and you will very soon be hearing from two experts who are going to guide us in the process of considering what adaptation options we have. You can read on this slide the areas that Roger Leventhal and Christina Hill will be talking about, but let me tell you a little bit about each of those speakers. So Roger Leventhal is a senior engineer in the Marin County Public Works Flood Control Division. Roger is responsible for engineering adaptation planning for sea level rise for Marin County Flood Control. He has a Master of Science degree from UC Berkeley in hydraulics and coastal engineering, and worked for over 23 years as a design consultant specializing in flood analysis, shoreline protection, and wetlands restoration prior to coming to Marin County in 2011. He's designed and constructed numerous wetlands projects around the Bay Area and has particular experience in the beneficial reuse of dredged sediments in wetlands. Dr. Christina Hill is an associate professor at UC Berkeley and is currently focused on developing proposals for urban adaptation to climate change in the San Francisco Bay Area and lectures internationally on ecology and design. She co-edited and authored the book Ecology and Design, Frameworks for Learning, and has published numerous book chapters and articles in scientific and professional journals. Christina has been recognized as a fellow of the Institute for Urban Design and as a Fulbright Scholar. Her most recent professional project was the Water Management Strategy for Greater New Orleans, where she advised a team of designers and engineers on water-based site and system design. Dr. Hill received a Master's of Landscape Architecture with distinction from Harvard University's Graduate School of Design and a Doctor of Philosophy in Landscape Architecture with a minor in ecology from Harvard University. So we look forward to them presenting to us in just a few minutes. Before we get there, I want to bring to your attention what I think are two questions that I hope you'll keep in mind as we work through the program today. The first is, what approaches should we pursue to address sea level rise and storm events, reduce and manage risks, and build resilience? And the second is, how can we increase coordination and establish partnerships among communities in our study area and beyond to address sea level rise? And finally, I wanted to end with a slide that I just took on a recent trip to Myanmar, Burma. One adaptation option that you'll be hearing about from Dr. Hill is living with water, and that's the title we chose for our program today. In many parts of the world, people are already living with water and doing so in very different ways. Conceiving of how to do that may require a mental mode shift for many of us. When our steering committee first got together and started off on this project, many of us viewed water as the enemy, something that we needed to hold back, to keep in abeyance, and to defend against. Over the course of the project and our learning and talking to experts and doing research, I think many of us have now come to have quite a different lens on our relationship with water and how we might live with it. So I look forward to hearing your thoughts today about what adaptation strategies may be appropriate for our southern Marin communities. We are here today not to provide answers, but really to share ideas, and as I said earlier, to start the conversation about what's important to our communities and what kind of changes we would like to see happen here and beyond in our Bay Area. So thank you again for being here. We're going to have a great morning. I look forward to all of your input, and I'm now going to pass the baton to Roger Leventhal.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Okay. Oh, I need to go to the beginning. Can you go back to the beginning, Alex? Easier.
Can I just ask one quick question? Could you address the sea rise in the last 100 years? It looked like it was 8 inches and a very, very gradual rise. And how do you project for the next 100 years? Is it going to be more than 8 inches?
Sure. There's actually
I said we had proposed keeping questions for the end of our day today, but because that question relates so specifically to something that I said, and I'm so pleased to have Roger here as the expert, you set me up very well to ask Roger to respond.
Well, I would say that there are, and you'll see this over when you get to the other area, there are many different projections of what's going to happen into the future. Projections often vary by assumptions based on how much conservation, how much the glaciers melt. There's a lot of different assumptions that go into various projections. There's a UN projections. There's the National Research Council came out with in 2012 projections for California, Washington, and we've incorporated some of those numbers. Almost all projections show an acceleration of sea level rise by mid-century. So the linear projection would keep this going at 8 inches, 9 inches per century, but there's almost no projections that really hold to that, and almost all of them show an acceleration somewhere in the, take your pick, 2030, 2050 time frame, and then a rise, a fairly wide rise in sea level rise. I don't know if we want to get off on this too much because we have a time limit, and there are different scenarios or different assumptions that go into it. That might be a better topic. I see your hand, but a better topic for as we get over to the other room, and I kind of probably need to keep going. So I think we'll take your question later if that's okay. So it's a pleasure to be here today. Like I said, I am a senior engineer. I have a hard engineering background in water resources. Dr. Hill from UC Berkeley is a landscape architect professor, so I think we've kind of covered the design professional, and we are giving you all a crash course in engineering adaptation alternatives. So for each of the major alternatives, essentially the tools in your toolbox that you will then be working with in the other room on the tabletop exercises, we're going to take the major tools and we're going to describe sort of what they are and how they work, show you how they look on the landscape, and also have a discussion of sort of the pros and the cons and the impacts from the various choices of adaptation alternatives. So we have a lot to cover. Before I launch into it, I just have a couple of background slides that really almost sort of emphasize what Supervisor Sears just said. And this is really looking at the eastern Marin shoreline. The dark blue and the light blue line is the current shoreline. The dark blue is the areas that are vulnerable to sea level rise. And really the main takeaway here is that the geography of Marin, which one reason it's such a beautiful place to live, is we tend to have steep hills grading quickly to marshy areas or former marshy areas that tend to subside. And so and a lot of our infrastructure is along that eastern shoreline. So we have an area that's very vulnerable to sea level rise. We can't forget, we also get flooding in our creeks. So we have, today we're talking a lot about direct coastal flooding and sea level rise, but we also have still creek flooding that we have to also deal with. So we get it, and we tend to have steep watersheds with flash flooding. And then today we're going to focus on Richardson Bay, which is actually maybe the most vulnerable of the vulnerable eastern Marin shoreline. And then a few years ago, somebody came out with a report that looked at the 9 Bay Area counties, and essentially Marin, just pointing out, is second really only to San Mateo in the number of, in this case, miles of road that are impacted by sea level rise. This one shows the number of buildings and contents that are impacted by sea level rise. And essentially, other than San Mateo, we're really number 2 in almost of all the 9 Bay Area counties. But it's important to note that our population is quite a bit less, I think under 300,000. So we don't have the, really the tax base or the revenue generating locally that some of these other counties really have. So I think it's going to be on us to be more creative and probably more resourceful in how we develop our adaptation strategies. So we have a lot of needs, but not a lot of necessarily people living here. So this just kind of emphasizes what Supervisor Sears said. What does sea level rise really mean? Well, it means that king tide flooding that you saw so much about today, which now happens maybe once a year and is more of a nuisance. Caltrans put the cones out and we all sort of live with it. Now that becomes a daily occurrence. And that's just at 12 inches, which almost any projection has us going past that. So, the pathways and the infrastructure will then be inundated basically daily. The storm flooding's worsened. So like I alluded to, we get storm flooding in our creeks. A lot of our systems still gravity drain, a lot of our drainage systems. On a higher tide, that gravity drainage system isn't going to work or work as well against those high tides. And we have areas of Marin where we currently have to bolt down our manholes because they're so low, really up in Santa Venetia. And there's so much pressure on them because of their elevation being low that they would fly off in storms. And, if you go to YouTube and Google flying manholes, you will find lots of videos, not from Marin, but elsewhere where this is a real phenomenon where these things take off. And so we have to bolt them down, and that will happen more and more stress on our gravity drainage system from the flooding, from the river flooding, as the tide rises. Shoreline worsens, and I'm going to show you some slides of the Marin shoreline here in a second. But higher waves track pretty linearly with depth. So as the water depth gets bigger, the waves are going to get bigger. Currently, within Inner Richardson Bay, it's a pretty low wave, almost no wave environment, but that will progressively become more and more important as a shoreline issue, not separate even from flooding as the sea level rises. And then finally, just getting everyone ready, the costs to maintain, to build, to our infrastructure will increase, notwithstanding even the flood insurance costs. And some of you here probably have been following the new FEMA mapping and its implications for flood insurance rates. And every time FEMA maps, they don't look forward to sea level rise, but they do look up to that point. So when they remap again, they will have accounted for it, and those rates will go up. So we have a lot of impacts that impact eastern side of Marin. So I wanted to do a quick tour of the eastern Marin shoreline just to kind of look around for how things are right now. This is out in Tiburon, and this is very common over a lot of our shoreline where we have sort of engineered, probably really more dumped material along the shoreline, maybe loosely engineered, and you can see sort of the erosion, the scarping, which is the cutting of the back part of the shoreline. This is Paradise Beach, and you can see where prior sort of armoring efforts people have done with blocks and then rock behind blocks. Well, we're starting to see the impacts of erosion behind the armoring. And this is also very common where we build things and then, over time we have to improve or maintain. They're not done with the first time you build them. So we're starting to see these impacts along the shoreline of wave erosion. Seminary Drive, you can see where the road winds around and they stopped armoring, I think because of it was out of the highest fetch, but then where it stopped, we're seeing more, scarping, which is eroding, where we're getting a very, very steep face along the edge of the road. Wanted to point out that they probably didn't install this pipe sticking out 5 or 6 feet into the air, just kind of eroding back of the shoreline. So you can see evidence now of the current conditions of what's going on along our shoreline. This is the Mill Valley shoreline, and you can see this is called slump block failure, where over time even the shorter waves can sort of progressively eat away at the shoreline, and then you get these sort of block failure. And this is happening along the Mill Valley marsh. This impacts habitat, impacts a lot of things. Water quality as the fine-grained sediment gets into the water. But this sort of slump block failures, you can just see it all the time. And here's some more examples. Another view sort of on the outer edge of Bothene Marsh of that sort of scarping and erosion. These are erosive signs of what's going on currently along the shoreline. So then what you do is the current way is some areas you go out to RFPs. I mean, I work for Public Works, and you get the standard sort of engineering solutions, and you start getting shorelines that look like this. Is up in San Rafael. Or more currently, we're starting to see more sheet pile wall armoring of the shorelines in response to flood control, and they're not incorrect, and they're maybe short-term effective, but it changes the look and feel of the shoreline. And this is kind of where we're heading in our the way we're doing business, essentially, as we hire people to, say, fix the shoreline, quote unquote. So this is just a view of kind of where we're heading, a future of walls and rocks and walls, and this is even the prison here. This is out by San Quentin. So this is the look and feel of the shoreline, but what's so great about this today is we are going to talk about sort of alternative visions too, in addition to these. So now I'm going to jump into really the heart of the next 30 minutes or so, which is the adaptation strategies. And there's many different ways to break these down, but I've chosen to look at them by the sort of the line in the sand, the protect ones, which consist of hard engineering, which are dikes and gates and pumping, and I'm going to talk to these here in a second. I'm going to do the first part of soft engineering, which are the new approaches to shoreline engineering, which actually Marin's been a real pioneer in some places. Then Christina is going to take it over from here, tidal wetlands, and then she has a lot of expertise and experience in sort of the other two big categories, which are sort of the managed retreat and accommodation, learning to live with water, the newer thinking in terms of shorelines and sea level rise. So what we're starting down today, though, ever since humans built the first set civilization, we've been adapting and working with water and flooding. So there's been some famous adapters throughout history that have used some of these tools. The first, I'm going to show a few here. The first is the Dutch guy, so way back when. And the Dutch, of course, most of their country is below sea level. Sometime in the 50s, they had sort of very horrific loss of life during flooding. So for them, adaptation and dealing with sea level rise is really very much of a mission. And I think Christina can talk more to that than I can. So they built, the original dikes probably looked like this way back when. Now, of course, they're more high tech. This is the Masterling gates, probably pronouncing that wrong. The big takeaway for me on this one is that, is that concept of maintenance. So I work in flood control. We have a staff of very dedicated, hardworking people that run around all day long putting their fingers in our dikes and fixing our pump stations, maintaining our pumps and our ditches. And this is concept of, when you build structures like this, you have to maintain them. And he gets double time after he's been standing there 8 hours. Triple time after, I think, 24 hours. And so that's something that we have to keep in mind as we look forward to the future. Of course, there was other people who looked more at managed. Moses, for instance, you could call that phased and managed retreat. He was maybe a very high-powered consultant type, and he had access to resources that we don't have because we typically manage the land and not the water. But the point's fairly well taken. And the important thing here is that this idea of phased, which I think is applicable to our shoreline, because there's things that we maybe need to do in the next 20, 30 years as we look towards the future to a higher rise. And we don't need to get so bogged down in dates. We can develop adaptation strategies based on triggers, on elevations, and that's really where this is going to go. We don't need to worry. We're not building anything on a schedule. We're going to go with what actually is happening. But this idea that we can phase or manage over time is an important takeaway from him. And then, of course, Noah, sort of the grandfather of the Richardson Bay Sausalito houseboat community, where he really went for accommodation and the sort of idea of floodable development. And I was thinking these people are the ones who didn't, communities that didn't plan ahead. So now we're going to look, I'm going to talk quickly to the hard engineering and try to give you sort of a vision of how they look. They tend to be sort of the levee, flood wall, gates. They're designed to hold something in place. And there's definitely a place for these sorts of solutions, absolutely. But of course, rigidity and all that requires, there's trade-offs. So there's, like all this stuff, there's benefits and costs. And it's the more traditional approach, easier to get design professionals to do these sort of things. So what do flood walls and gates look like? Well, these are the sort of standard seawalls. They're engineered structures. There's often, I think, people don't realize there's probably more below ground than there is above ground. These foundation for structures like this are very important. You have to protect the foundations from erosion. And for a lot of structures, you really need to have for a deep foundation. Water is heavy, and once it gets moving, it's powerful. I think we all know that. So it's no easy, I think as a hydraulic engineer, you really learn humility and humbleness in the face of dealing with water. And building structures like this is no easy task, but of course, we have done them throughout time. The current trend, this is really sandy. A lot of these coasts now, because it's cheaper, they're driving in sheet pile walls everywhere along the beaches, and that's kind of how they look, arguably uglier than some of these other ones. Both block your views, but this is sort of how these linear structures look, highly engineered. This is a very dramatic side. I'm not saying, this is from New Orleans. I'm not saying we're going to have anything that looks like this necessarily. These are probably 16 feet high. But, we could be looking at a future of half of this, 4 or 5, 7 feet tall walls. And we don't have hurricanes, but we do have southerly driven storms. And if the water depth gets up there, we could be looking at a sort of a mini version of this. It's just very dramatic. And as a side here, I realized as I go into a lot of sea level rise talks the last few years, is that the engineers like me tend to like to show these sort of disaster or near disaster slides, sort of kind of in this, nature could kill us all tomorrow sort of thing. Landscape architects, who are also very involved in sea level rise and I work with, really is the exact opposite. They tend to show slides that are always sort of bucolic, nice day, couple strolling on the shoreline, waving a happy animal type slide. So I'm not sure of the difference of why that is, except for maybe they're fundamentally happier people. So I tend to show more disaster slides, and we'll leave Christina to show more of the nicer ones. Well, it originally was, that's true. There's an example also from Christina of what happens when the walls fail. Again, a New Orleans example. Levees. Levees are earthen versions of the seawalls. They're, as you know, they're made to hold back water. Typically, they're preferred where you have the room, which is the big deal. You need more right-of-way. You need much more space for a levee. In a lot of our places, we don't have that kind of room. And you need soil to build it. And this is one up in the Delta, California. But this is Coyote Creek levee, right near here. These are not built to 100-year levels. These are probably maybe 20-year. And it just gives you a sense of how these look on the landscape. There's a concept now being floated of course, Japan, everything's sort of supersized. And this idea of a super levee, which is a much bigger levee, but not only that, where you, in a sense, you don't live behind the levee, you, what I call sort of raise and raise. And the first raise is R-A-Z-E, where you raise all these buildings, and then you raise them up and rebuild everything on top. So it's no small thing to do. It's in your toolkit, but of course, all this dirt has to come from somewhere, and it would fundamentally alter how the landscape looks. But the advantage, of course, is you're up now high. You're not sort of behind the levee that could fail. So here's an example of actually one really looks in Japan. And then, of course, you can combine them. That's what they're starting to do, I think, down in New Orleans, where they don't have room to build on top anymore, any more earthen, so they're starting to go levees and flood walls on top. So it's a highly engineered approach. And I wanted to remind people, again, that when you have walls, you have to pump behind them. And so this is a big part of what we do in flood control. This is, again, sort of a supersized New Orleans example. We wouldn't necessarily have anything this big, but we have small versions of this already. We probably have 8 pump stations operating in Marin right now. I would say gallon per gallon is probably the most expensive way to go. They're very maintenance intensive. Of course, during storms is when the power goes out, so you need to either have generators or you're not going to have any pumping when the power's gone. And so they become big structures, and you can start seeing sort of a supersized example from New Orleans of protecting communities with gates and pumping. Moving on to gates, and we hear a lot about the European example. In Holland and Germany, for instance, they have gates almost everywhere. This is the gates up here. I won't even try to pronounce that. Master Kering. For a little bit of scale, since gates are going to come up in Richardson Bay here later, this gate structure here, which I think in today's dollars is well over $1 billion, is about a little more than half the size it would take to do in Richardson Bay. So it's smaller than what we would need, but it's still a fairly major structure in how it has to control high tide flows or dampen high tides. Here's an example of some smaller gates that you typically have seen more on creek mouths, and we're going to talk a little more than this. And this is a game piece in your plan that we'll be working on here a little bit later. Right now, they're hard to permit. They have impacts, often are fish passage impacts, although there are some creative people who are looking at sort of fish doors, they call them, that theoretically the fish can go in and out. Here's some sort of another examples. They don't look all that beautiful, but they maybe have a flood dampening effect up our creeks. Here's another example. This is supposedly comes up and allows the fish passage at low flows. Moving on. There's 2 proposals out there for gates across Richardson Bay. The first is by Marin Councilman Gary Lyons, looking at using the footings of the 101 bridge. It's an interesting, I think, innovative idea. And then there's another one, Liz Rainieri, architect, who's got this folding waters example a little bit further out. So this would be advantage of even you can see the interest in it because we have sort of a narrow bay. You don't have to do a lot of the shoreline if you can block off high tides, but they have definite impacts, and Christina's going to talk more to these in a few minutes. And like I say, the summary points to me, anyway, of taking away the European example is that they're, so far to date, although this is changing, taking much more of a hard engineering approach, much more use of taking the private for the public good, eminent domain, something we don't really do in flood control very much, because they have more of a nationalistic understanding of their vulnerabilities and the needs to join together. Say Christina's going to go into this much more. I wanted to have a few slides that talk about sort of placing things on the shoreline and how that's going to look. And so this is from our shoreline study. We're working on a flood control, sort of dividing the Richardson Bay shoreline into different reaches, and they all have their own characteristics that I won't go into in detail. You can see the Marin City is very narrow, has public. Coyote Creek has Coyote Creek and Bothnia Marsh, Mill Valley. And then over here around the Strawberry Peninsula, it's much more privately owned, and there's much narrower when you have the homes right up to the edge of the water. So even in the Richardson Bay shoreline, we have very unique characteristics. One thing you're going to do when you start looking at the boards and thinking about shoreline adaptation is to say, well, where are we going to do things? So I would say if you're going to look at a very wall or levee-centric view, this would be what it takes, like saying you would have to do to not impact Bothnia Marsh up Coyote Creek. Alternatively, with the game, you can look at putting, say, maybe a small gate at the mouth, and then it cuts down on the amount of levee you might need for running up the channel. So I'm not proposing anything. This is more of giving you a little bit of a preview of what you're going to be doing here very soon in terms of laying out alternatives on the actual bay. Same game, same view over here in the Mill Valley shoreline. If we just protect the built areas, essentially that's what this does, which is not even something we have to necessarily do. Then you're looking at levees or walls, and really it would be walls up here, because there's no room for levees, all along here, up ACMDP, Arroyo Corte Madera Creek. Perhaps a smaller gate here at the upper end of the marsh eliminates some levee. If you want to try to maintain your bike path in its current location, or the dog park, then it sets up muting and impacting a lot more of the marsh down lower. So again, trade-offs and alternatives, and so that's sort of what you're going to be getting into here very soon. Finally, I'm going to end on natural solutions. I'm not too far over. of for shoreline, and the one I'm very familiar with is the use of coarse-grained bay beaches for wind wave erosion. Having built one here in outer Richardson Bay when I was a consultant before I came to the county, and then Christina is going to talk about tidal marsh and other sorts of natural solutions. So Aramburu Island is in sort of outer Richardson Bay up here. It's a sort of backwards horseshoe. It was a man-made island that was eroding, actually even more so than the photos I showed you in the Mill Valley shoreline. It gets a pretty good fetch from the southern storms, which are our big storms, and had eroded about 70 feet and about a 4 or 5 foot tall scarp. Just giving you the quick highlights, we got some oil spill money from the Costco Busan, built a bay beach, gravel back barrier berm and the sandy foreshore back in 2011 and 2012. And then this is post-construction. And it looks just really beautiful. It's done very well through a series of very big storms we had in the spring of 2013. And this is how it looks post we had big storms in April of 2013. And this is how it looked about a year ago. And it's been used as a sort of a model, local model, even regionally, for the use of this natural solutions for combating wind wave erosion. We have great birds. The birds have just been off the charts, oyster catchers. We even got front page in the Marin IJ for these little guys, which is very exciting. And the Audubon, Richardson Bay Audubon's been monitoring it, and it's been a really great, so far, demonstration project of alternative solutions for sea level rise and wind wave erosion. And we've also have proposals in right now to do this at a few other spots, demonstration projects around the Mill Valley shoreline, to address some of these issues that I showed you before about scarping and erosion of the shoreline. And then this slide, provided by Christina, shows that the Dutch are now heading into the use of getting away from sort of all the hard engineering solutions and starting to look at beach-type solutions like we have locally for their work. And with that, I'll have Christina take over.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me, because I'm trying to pick up and do the handoff. So what I want to talk about this slide and the next, this is what it looked like when they finished building something they called the sand engine on the coast of the Netherlands. Their idea was, why should we use bulldozers across a 9-mile stretch of this shoreline to widen the beach and dunes if we can let the wind and the waves do it? So they piled the sand up in this big shape, and now in the last couple of years, the wind and the waves are doing it. The dunes are growing, the beach is getting wider, and the Dutch are so clever about these things. They actually believe that this is going to be, that if this works and all that sand gets redistributed by the wind and waves, the cost will be 25% the cost of traditional beach nourishment. So the Dutch are not just doing the biggest projects, they're thinking about the cost. And this is an area in which all of us should think about a no-regrets conservative approach about how we use our resources. So the Dutch have become leaders on the reducing cost side as well. And it's interesting to look at some of these strategies like this sand engine, which is designed, this is the only slide I'll show in Dutch, I promise, which is designed to go from a shape like this over time to a shape like this, and then eventually just be a much wider beach. So when we're looking at Marin and thinking about what our options are around the whole bay and around coasts all around the world, really, we're talking about situations where we could do something like a barrier. This is, of course, the Richardson Bay Bridge, or farther out. We could do something like the sand engine on a marsh and sand side, and we have to decide, are we going to think about building a barrier? Are we going to look at raising and extending the marsh? And I'll talk more about why we might do those things. But let me just say, as we look at what the Dutch have done and learned from, and they have tried the most experiments, so that's why we look at them. They know how much things have cost. They've tried a wide range of ideas. They have not had as much of a biodiversity concern. This is, of course, a California clapper rail, and that's one of the things we have to think about around the bay. If something is illegal today to do, it's probably because it's going to affect some unusual species. And I don't think we're at the point yet in terms of our panic level that we're ready to give up all those species and all that work we've done to think about biodiversity and the beauty of the San Francisco Bay landscape. But that's where we could be in the future if things got really bad. We'd have to be questioning, can we sustain biodiversity at the same time we protect ourselves? This is where the Dutch are at now. This is an article that was in the journal Nature last year. Nature is the premier international science journal. To get a paper in Nature makes your career. That's like, major, winning an Olympic gold medal or something. And this paper is so good that it made Nature, and what it's arguing is that conventional coastal engineering like seawalls they're very problematic. They're causing problems to the people who own them in terms of the maintenance and the cost of adjusting them and growing them over time. And the Dutch are now arguing that ecosystem restoration is not only better from a multifunction point of view of providing us with recreational resources, biodiversity, fisheries, but it's also more cost effective. This is a major moment in thinking about coastal engineering, to think that it's going to save us money and be multifunctional and be easier to manage over time. This is data from Maine in the US that shows, and I wanted to give a couple of points about what happens when you gate a marsh. When you put a tide gate on, when you put a barrier up, when you change the amount of salt water that flows into a coastal area. This is the ungated marsh, the density of fish that they found when they checked that marsh. This is the gated marsh, obviously a huge difference, about 3 fish per square yard versus 17 fish per square yard. So we see a lot fewer fish. And if you are a fisher person, if you care about fisheries for other reasons, this is a big deal, changing the marsh. This is impossible to read, I'm sure, but this is a map of the San Francisco Bay, and these green areas are areas where there's a lot of sediment in the bay water. In this particular area of South Marin, there's not a lot of sediment in the bay water. The way that intertidal marshes grow is that sediment comes in on the flood tide, on the high tide, and then as the tide kind of hangs there for a sec before it ebbs back out again, the sediment drops. So we get intertidal marshes made with silt because we have silt in the water column, in the bay water, and because high tides can come in. As soon as you gate a marsh, you cut out the high tide. So you cut out the sediment supply for marshes on the shore. This is an illustration from that paper in Nature. I'm sorry, that date's wrong. It's 2013. And it shows what Roger was showing of a leveed estuary. This orange is a wall, and urban areas behind it. And it shows subsidence in the land that's protected by the wall. The reason there's subsidence is because it's not getting sediment inputs. That's one of the big reasons why marshes subside behind a wall. So you actually end up, like New Orleans and like the Netherlands, farther below sea level if you build walls to try to protect yourself. So you kind of back into a worse problem. This is what the Dutch are now recommending to all of us who have not yet bought a Dutch barrier around the world, is not to put a wall around the whole estuary marsh, but to actually have openings and make sure that we have some kind of dike embankment that we've allowed to bring sediment, allowing the high tide to bring sediment in and keep the land surface high and keep the biodiversity high. So we may be able to save ourselves trouble by looking at what the Dutch are doing now instead of doing what they did 50 years ago. And that's a very important point to learn about the Dutch experience. They have changed. They are not doing the barriers before, except in areas where they were already committed, and they're doubling down on investments they were already committed to. So I'm going to share with you, Roger said this is a crash course. I'm going to save you a lot of money and explain the essence of landscape architecture so you don't have to go get a master's degree in landscape architecture. Dig, hole, make mound. You dig locally and you make a mound locally. You cut and fill to be able to change the shape of the landscape. And by changing the shape of the landscape, you change the way it works. You change the functions of that landscape. So think about this as the ocean on this side and the water coming from Mount Tam and everything else up in the hills on this side. This hole is going to have a purpose, and this mound is going to have a purpose. We can make very shallow cuts and then place that material in a wedge on the bay side to attenuate waves, create habitat, and protect ourselves and have stormwater be able to sit somewhere as it comes down. And depending on how we manage tributary mouths, we can get rid of that water by pumping or by gravity flow. And that may change over time. You're very fortunate in Marin to have Roger Leventhal, and he hasn't paid me to say this. He is one of the most forward-looking people in the country that I have worked with over the last 10 years thinking about these issues, because he's willing to look at what's happening in the environment. This is China Camp, where sand came down from the slope and began to form fingers of sand over a wetland, which then grew up into vegetation. So he's looking at how do wetlands actually grow taller? How do they keep up with sea level rise? And this is what actually happened after a storm in China Camp. And then he proposed doing this for some marshes here, where he would arrange to add, as an engineer mimicking nature, sediment to the top of a marsh that then plants could grow up onto. And by planning ahead and doing this a little bit at a time, we could raise our wetlands to be able to keep up with sea level rise. And the fundamental insight that the Dutch have had that we could have here in the Bay Area is that our vulnerability now is losing our intertidal wetlands, having water come in, obviously, to build areas and to roads, but losing our wetlands and losing beaches. What if we could take those most vulnerable structures and make them our asset, make them our strategy for how to keep out the water? And that's really what raising marshes is about, taking your vulnerability and turning it into your strength. This marsh at Corte Madera is a marsh that's been studied by USGS and by BCDC as an example of wave attenuation by marsh. And they've found that even 200 feet of marsh and less, 30 feet of marsh, gets a big effect in reducing the height of the spring tide. So marshes and landscapes in general, beaches, marshes, are doing work.
When you say 30 feet, you mean building it out horizontally?
Having it be in the intertidal zone at least 30 feet out from the structure where you want to have the waves smaller, from the place where your goal is to have the waves or the surge be smaller. At least 30 feet. That's a kind of a happy thing for all of us who are thinking about not having enough room. But moving those marshes out farther and making them taller is the real key. This is what the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development is funding off Staten Island in New York City. It's an idea to build breakwaters and then allow marshes to grow on the edge of the shoreline. Those breakwaters essentially trip the waves, the really big hurricane waves, and make them crash farther out. They lose their energy farther out, and they're not as threatening as they come into the built environment. So it's a very smart idea. It's being funded with hundreds of millions of dollars. We will all learn about it and what to do, how to do things like it. My students are doing designs or proposals to kind of raise test balloons in places like San Leandro, where right now houses come right up to a seawall here, and that's all the bay. And what the student proposed in one of my classes was putting a beach into this area, a big beach as a recreational asset, and then thinking about how that beach would protect this housing back here from water in the bay. And we're lucky we don't have hurricanes, because we can use our landscape as a strength even more than places that do have hurricanes. And the view from that housing would not be a terrible view. A view over a marsh, as everyone in Marin knows, is a beautiful view. It's not quite the same, but it's a beautiful view. This is a proposal another student did for how to deal with a wetland treatment plant, by building brackish marsh around the plant, that the plants are actually fed by nutrients in the wastewater from the plant. Rather than pumping all that wastewater up to the East Bay Mud facility in Oakland, we could use that water to grow the defenses around the sewage treatment plant, and that can happen here also. This is another proposal for up in Richmond, where UC has a proposed campus location. One of the students said, what if we build a sand and rock barrier island like the ones that Roger Leventhal has been building here in Richardson Bay, to grow the marsh that's already there and create habitat and shallow the land, shallow the water. This is now a new verb that's coming out of New York City, shallowing, to shallow as a verb, to allow silt to accumulate so that we can reduce wave energy and protect those areas from some of the impacts of sea level rise. And the initial part of the impact of sea level rise is really the increased king tide heights and the increased storm surge and wave heights. So if we can deal with those waves and surges for about 20, 25, 30 years into the future from today, we're going to buy ourselves time to do something smart. And I think what we're going to be able to buy ourselves time to do is something that builds in this environment. This is a place in the Netherlands, in Rotterdam, where the Dutch actually live in a wet pond. It's a pond that holds stormwater and river water. And they live in beautiful homes on the water, on piles. It's not floating. They're on structural piles. But they have 3 or 4 feet of headroom for more stormwater to come into that pond. So it's an example of dig hole, make mound in Rotterdam, but then sell houses in the hole. Again, something the Dutch are quite clever at. Living with water is living with infrastructure and an artificial shoreline as well as living with a natural shoreline. This is the German version. No biodiversity interests or concerns here, but this is a hardened first floor story in a place called the Harbor City or Hafen City in Hamburg, and this is a traditional seawall. And people who walk along this promenade up here are mostly looking out at the water. No one ever notices that there's nothing on these walls. It's kind of funny from an urban design perspective. And as the water rises, here's that promenade with the hardened first floor, which is either filled with earth or filled with a waterproof parking garage. Get your head wrapped around that, a waterproof parking garage. That's something Americans don't build yet, but we could. And then the low tide on that seawall, let me show you how it changes if you can kind of see the edge. There's the bright line of the high tide still on the seawall, and here's the bright line of the storm flood they get once or twice a year that's now on the face of the first story of the buildings. And the beauty of it is that people know to put their cars, except this person who apparently went to Malaga and was not tracking. Most people have put their cars in the parking garages that are waterproof, and then they come out with their families and play in the floodwater. They don't evacuate. And their roads and their houses are all above the level of the flood. It's called tiered development, tiers. And the idea is that they build these places where you can live in the wet pond. You can have density of some kinds. I'm not going to be the person who comes to Marin and talks about density. This is Germany. This could be smaller. But there's infrastructure behind these structures that's protected from any kind of flooding. So there's a top tier that gets no flooding in floodable development. But it takes time to build this kind of staircase of strategies. And you want to build them in such a way that beaches and wetlands are part of the mix. Otherwise, you've lost that amazing recreational and aesthetic experience that makes places like Marin County so attractive. And it may be that the present shoreline is here, and that what has to happen is we have to grow the whole system out from the present shoreline. The location of the bay shore today is a kind of arbitrary artifact of when Save the Bay got filling to stop. It's not optimized. It's an artifact of the fact that these women got this to happen at a particular moment in time. So it isn't clear to me that the position of the current shoreline is the only position we can ever reasonably have. We may want to do some shallowing and consider how we can relocate it. So the basic point is that landscapes can do work for us. They're not just an aesthetic amenity or a recreational benefit. They can do work that we should pay for, and they can do it more cost effectively. We can use these landscapes to buy ourselves time until the rate of sea level rise may increase. And if the rate of sea level rise doesn't increase because you've seen headlines that China, India, the United States, and Europe have all drastically reduced their CO2 emissions, super. This is a no-regrets strategy where we've built an amazing landscape for ourselves and supported biodiversity and handed something off to future generations. Building barriers could be a maladaptive strategy where you spend a lot of money, you have to maintain it in perpetuity, and it's something that you regret if sea level doesn't rise as much as people are saying it will. And then tiered development is something we can adopt when we get out to 2030, and it turns out that stuff is happening that we're afraid of the rate of sea level rise that we're seeing by 2030. If it does accelerate, we have options of how to build in that landscape. Not everywhere, but in some locations in a kind of patchy way. So thank you.
Okay, good morning, neighbors. My name is Kevin Conger. I'm a Tam Valley resident and one of the volunteers that's been working with this group for the past year or so. How's that? Are we up? Okay. So what we're going to do now is ask you all to question all this information and to discuss it. We're going to do that in smaller groups over in this room, over here. You all have a number on your badge of 1 through 10. And what's going to happen is that you're going to go to one of the 5 information stations over here. Each station has 2 numbers. So 1 and 2 are here, 3 and 4 are there, 5 and 6 are there, 7 and 8 are in the back wall, 9 and 10 are right here behind this black curtain. All this information that you just saw is going to be there. I'm going to give you a summary of what that looks like here in just 1 second. We're going to have that conversation amongst yourself in these smaller groups of about 20 for about a half an hour. And then you guys are going to break up in even smaller groups and go to workstations where you're going to solve this problem. So this is getting to the point where we stop talking and you all start talking and start doing the work. So the first step is these information stations. As I said, there's 5 stations. They all have the same information, so you don't have to worry that somebody somewhere else in the room is talking about something better than you. They repeat this information about what's happening with sea level rise, this kind of basic information, the impacts on the community, and the adaptation strategy. There'll be a facilitator at each of these stations to help explain the information on the boards and take notes and keep the conversation moving along. This is what some of that information looks like. It's a lot of it you've seen already in this slideshow. A lot of these same graphs that show the different studies for sea level rise and where they came from and what the different time frames are and all of that. So you'll be able to look a little bit more closely at that and ask questions to one another about what it all means. There'll be the maps that show all of the assets in the study area and how they're impacted by 3 feet of sea level rise, so you'll understand kind of what's happening where. And we're going to ask you to do a kind of a fun exercise called Pin Your Priorities, where we're going to give you little tape dots and ask you to put them on the map to indicate things that you're concerned about or care about. We have a series of maps that show how the neighborhood impacts change with 1 foot, 2 foot, 3 foot, 4 foot, 5 foot, 6 foot of sea level rise, so you can see it under many different scenarios. And lastly, there's going to be information about all the things that Roger and Christina just talked about: seawalls, dikes, levees, super levees, marshes, all those types of adaptation strategies that you may want to think about. And ultimately, then what we're going to ask you to do is to wrap your head around all this stuff and then get to these game boards. So again, there's 10 stations. There'll be 10 people in each. Go to the one that has your number on it. There'll be a facilitator there to help get it going, but it's largely going to be led by you all in a conversation that you guys organize. We're gonna have you elect a group spokesperson to kind of do a very, very quick report out and summary at the end of this. And what this kind of looks like, here's the game board. It's a map of the study area. It shows 36 inches of sea level rise. We've just picked 36 inches so we don't have a long debate about should we plan for 1 foot or 5 feet. We've just decided for the purpose of the exercise today, let's just take a look at what 3 feet of sea level rise means and talk about strategies for that. This is not, your ideas for this are not going to get built next week or next year. So this is really not an exercise to find the perfect solution. This is an exercise to facilitate a conversation amongst ourselves about what some of these different options might mean. There are a series of these game pieces that are going to be made available for you that show tidal gates, seawalls, levees, new marshes, all of these sort of things. And you'll be placing these on the map in different ways and making decisions about where a levee might be more appropriate, or a tidal gate might be required, or a marsh restoration might be part of a solution. And it's important that if you get to a solution very quickly and your group feels like that's maybe a good one, but you still have a lot of time left, maybe you want to try another one just to keep the conversation moving. There'll be somebody there with an iPhone or a camera to take pictures of them as you go. And so at the end, if you get to where there's 5 minutes left, and I'll give a notice that says when there's 5 minutes left, and you say, hey, I think that one we had earlier was a better one, you can quickly put the pieces back, and then the facilitator will tape that all down so that we can record it and do the report out. We've done this game in a group as a kind of test scenario. It's a challenge. It's a lot of information to kind of try and wrap your head around and to understand, and to try and process it and figure out what to do. But if you just jump right in, it moves along pretty quickly. So we're going to just go over to this side. There'll be facilitators there that'll help you find what station you're supposed to get at.
So you'll see demolish and remove as a game piece, putting in parks or new developments to relocate things. Or let's think about defending assets and some of the tools you heard about in the presentations earlier. Those tidal gate tools, whether they're large or small, residences. Environmental consideration, marshes, wetlands, etc. Creeks. Communities themselves, community assets like parks and recreations, schools, community centers, they're highlighted here. And just other vulnerabilities.
Super levee would be somewhere, a very large levee that you can actually develop on. New development, where would be good places for new development to occur in lieu of potentially losing some development from managed retreat.
Maybe on some sort of super levee or less.
Maintained, and then you're just building this up, building the levee up.
See, this is going to do that naturally. You don't have to build anything.
Well,
there
no, if it goes up 3 feet, it's not gonna prevent the water from flooding.
You do have infrastructure here, right? Right. You have water pumps. Right. I mean, so you know, the sewage from these houses has to go somewhere. Of course. So if you turn that into, you know.
So you relocate that, right?
Yes.
Like that. If anything, if you want to levee, what we need to levee more is kind of down on the other side of the marsh to protect all of this, right? Yes, we could raise this up and make the marsh higher, and that's probably a good idea to do, but it's still going to, this is still a low spot with homes on it, too much infrastructure. So how do we protect it?
This will do more to push back the ocean than any other thing we could possibly place on the board. So I would place it in every home if I had a piece. Yeah. And by the way, one last minute comment.
This is new wetland. It's already there.
Yeah, but it'll expand out.
Some of these pieces accelerate.
So what we'd like to do is move this along pretty quickly. We're really interested to hear about what was the conversation that your group had, what were the things where there seemed to be consensus, what were the things where there seemed to be a lot of debate or disagreement, what were those issues, and the kind of main takeaway points of where you think your main conclusions. So why don't we just start down at one end and each person do it kind of move it right along and just pass the mic down and away we go.
I'm sorry to be the first one. We were the most probably contentious one. We really couldn't agree on anything. And I see a lot of the same elements. We had groups who wanted to completely wipe all the commercial out of here. We had an element that wanted to reroute the bike path here. And we had a barrier island concept, like Christina Hill was talking about, to basically protect the whole edge here and probably around here. When we started talking about that, obviously we got a problematic issue here where people are using the water for their boat access. So we had restore shoreline center area to marsh, or put a levee system in there to protect it. We had Transportation 101 constituent who wanted to make sure they could get up to Novato and back. We have an idea about putting the bike path the same as the path that's here, raise it up and have it elevated over a marsh that then gets restored. We have basically the concept of not having any egress into the bay was considered versus this idea of developing ecosystem into the bay. That was an issue we talked about. We had some who thought Mill Valley Dog Park ought to go into wetlands. We have the high tide barrier folk who said if we turn into some sort of a levee barrier raisable system, that could protect this area. Yeah, I think I covered everything.
All right. We had representatives from Marin City all the way up through the hills of Mill Valley. Anyway, our basic concern was the strip between of Route 101, the exit of Sausalito, all the way up to the Manzanita exit there. We considered that to be a critical area that had to be addressed now. And we found out some things that a lot of people didn't know. The pond, or we call it a wetland, over in Marin City is collecting groundwater, and it's influencing that whole shopping center. And people are moving out of the shopping center because they're getting wetness in their understructure there. So we could do some very dramatic things over there. We could do the elevation of the whole, knock down the whole shopping center, build a levee, and do that elevated levee thing like we were shown in one of the demos there. Another thing we could do to try and protect it is to raise the marsh area there by the dumping fill and getting that marshland higher so that there wouldn't be a collection of water there. We felt in Marin City that it would be beneficial if there were a rainwater collection station coming down. There are many high houses on Donahue Street coming down, so that if we put some type of water collection system there, it would be an emergency gap, and it might stop some of the flooding of the shopping center there. So there were various things. Concern over, and a pumping station could be put in where that swamp is over there. Along Route 101, right after you get on from Sausalito, might have to build a small levee, not a dam. What do you call it? The wall, a seawall, okay. And then we're going to start with natural wetlands, where we'd be dumping different soil along the way and creating that wetlands to grow there and the marsh to raise up. The marsh is very, very sunken. As you all know, you cannot get off Tam Valley Road when we have a king tide or any other thing there. So we need that immediate concern over there with helping to raise that whole area. As you can see, we've improved the wetland all the way up into so that Miller Street would not flow. We need to raise our marshland there by doing some type of rethings. There's a suggestion that the floating homes, if it got too much marshland in the floating home area at Commodore Marina, they could be built up like the picture that was done where the boats are kind of up and over and elevated over the water. There could be a change of configuration there. Getting marshland in this whole area, possibly with the Audubon's help in the Commodore Marina area, would strongly help that area. Years from now, we might have to get rid of the Manzanita parking lot and turn that all into big marshland. We need to increase our marshland in this whole area. What else didn't I cover? Oh, we would want some water retention over here in Tam Valley also. Possibly we'd have to put a gate at the mouth of the Coyote Creek here. Let's see. Let me think what else. I got so many things here. we did a lot. Okay. Yeah, gating that might be necessary to gate there. There is a pump house up here, which was brought up just up in Strawberry Point where that island was that was done over. It's working now, but that might still be considered a flood area at one time or another. But we need to grow the marshes in this whole area now.
Laura Cheriton. So I notice a theme here. We're actually in sync with a lot of what's being said and thought about, which is we're wanting to have horizontal levees, and wherever there's an opportunity to have marshes reestablished and brought back, because this used to all be tidal marsh in here, and we're working with the actual flow of water from the creeks and trying to increase biodiversity. And so as a result, the engineering that was done to Coyote Creek will hopefully be able to reestablish its original pattern. And in that, we'll have, hopefully we'll have salmon come back to this watershed, but we'll also be asking birdland people to raise their houses and adapt to the water. And we're asking retreat from the east side of Shoreline Highway, which has been projected anyway. And then back up where Miller is, where Miller and the Arroyo Corte Madera del Presidio is, and there's a lot of things built on fill in the tidal marsh. One of the things that we haven't discussed is what happens in major earthquakes and subsidence and all that. And so we think that there might be some issues around that that haven't really been addressed yet. So we're asking retreat of the sewage treatment plant and the middle school. And someone asked me, well, where are they going to put the sewage? And I said, let's do composting let's do composting toilets, because using potable water to flush our effluent is kind of crazy at this point in time with water being so short. So we also have people near Camino Alto possibly living with water. We have a pump station there for the redwoods. And we haven't really addressed some of these other issues down here, but we had a lot of conflict around the heliport and Manzanita, that we have different adaptation strategies for whatever people in our group were deciding, so that doesn't get worked out too well. Thanks. And I'm sharing it with this guy.
Hello, I'm Michael Rex, architect in Sausalito, and we didn't think there were enough options or alternatives, so we added some more game tokens, actually 4 of them. One of them is a moratorium, a very short-term temporary moratorium to get people's attention. So we have time to create some new building standards for new buildings, so those buildings are adaptable as the seas rise. So they'd be easily raised as needed, both the land and the buildings. We don't like moratoriums, but we thought it might be necessary so we can take more prompt action. Another one was we added a game token to actually raise buildings and raise land. Maybe not as dramatic as the super levees or the tiered construction, but we're seeing that happening now, and it's something that could be done relatively affordable, so we put that in as an option. We also wanted to raise our roadways. We see that with a 3-level rise, some of our important roadways are going to be underwater, and so we need to. We thought we needed a specific focus on that. We also wanted to add, as we heard from number 2, detention basins for fresh water. We know that we get a lot of upland flooding when the seas, the tides get high and back up the outlets and discharge for fresh water. So we identified several places, maybe in the Tam Valley area, possibly in Marin City, converting that pond to a freshwater detention basin, and possibly somewhere up in the Mill Valley area. We didn't like the idea of building levees and walls. We kind of agree with the presenters earlier that they're expensive and hard to maintain. So we really wanted to promote living with water and marsh restoration and raising structures as the primary solutions. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Peter Fimwright. I live in Tam Valley, and our consensus was really that we prefer new wetlands in every place that it's possible. But obviously that won't work in some areas, so our next choice was the horizontal levees, which we have here, and we felt that we should expand the wetlands all along here, and obviously Highway 101 needs to be protected, so once again, if the wetlands and horizontal levee doesn't work, we would probably need a seawall to protect the highway. We had a lot of discussion about these areas, which are businesses built on wetlands, whether to let it go or not. And some of us felt, eventually perhaps they would be need to let go, or a super levy would be the solution if we need to keep those businesses there. Also, we discussed putting some sort of reef, or even at the mouth of Richardson Bay, have some sort of cascading water system. But here we talked about the reef because the ugly highway is already there. So, and what's that? At the bridge, that's what I meant, yeah. And that's generally it. The houseboats, they would have to deal with the utilities and all of that, but we felt they could be let go. They would have to deal with the rising water. They do float after all. And these are two, apparently the tidal gates are already here, and but they haven't worked for years, so those would be fixed.
Hi, Ned Hagerty. I'm Group 8. I live in Tam Junction. Ours, I think, is a fairly aggressive approach. As you can see, I'll go south to north sort of here, where I think initially we have levees along the Sausalito portion here and retreat, and hopefully a beach being forming here in front of a seawall, and again retreat. I think it's the general posture that we had to give way on these kinds of developments in light of what's ahead of us. And then moving into here, you see more, again, levee activity, and then more properly up into Tam Junction, and certainly. Again, I think here it's retreat, and I think a couple of points to be made in this area, because this has been such a contested area for so long. Or I think I should, before I leave here, obviously it's been touched on, 101 is going to be very much impacted, and that's a major consideration. What's going to happen? How will we sustain that flow in light of things that are coming? But in Tam Junction, retreat certainly, and build up marsh, put a levee here, there are pump stations. And I think what I heard the group saying is, let's recall what the plan was for Tam Junction, that we've done a lot of, over the years. There is a master plan here that calls for marsh development and retreat already, and it hasn't been implemented. So we have a very easy first step, one could argue. And then with that, creating new marsh, and again, in here, getting these flows of creeks worked out so we get some outflow. And then as you move north here, of course, you see we have these levees and creating marsh. Primarily, I guess the vision here is to get some outflow again, but create levees and create marsh, build that marsh up, and look for ways maybe to convert parks up in this area to become retention ponds, to slow things down. So elevate Highway 1 with wall and levee beach, this area, a combination of retreat and living with water, certainly in the birdland into Tam Junction area, reef at Bridge with new wetlands and horizontal levees. Retreat along east side of Tam Junction levee, Highway 1 living, okay. And I think there's some retreat up in here in this area also, but I think that, as you can see the vision there, but I think the group also was concerned that what are, of course, aligned with that, what are the ecological impacts of all this? This is a lot of movements, and I think a lot of this, we probably would feel pretty confident when you build up a marsh that that might be a good thing. But when you start to levee and the vulnerability of pump stations and things of that sort, of course, is a huge question to be answered. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Hart. I'm just going to briefly go over a few of the key discussions we had, and then I'll pass it on to some of the members of the group to talk about the specific solutions we came up with. So the first thing we talked about is that we sort of pretty quickly divided the map into 3 different areas of concern. We had the Marin City area, sort of Tam Junction area, and the Redwoods Tam High area. And at first we were wondering whether or not we should just try to address all 3 of these problems with one big solution right here in the center. But eventually we kind of came to the conclusion that that would be a little too unwieldy and we needed a more nuanced response to all these problems. So then we started looking at the individual areas. And the next sort of big question that came up was whether we should just retreat from a lot of these low-lying areas, as people have said, or whether we should put in all the time and money it would take to create solutions for those areas, which might, in addition to being costly and time-consuming, might also be sort of aesthetically unpleasing. So that sort of led to our next conclusion, which was sort of the general principle for all the solutions we created. As Jim summarized it, we decided that we value ecology more than just sort of creating these very pragmatic solutions to all these problems. So that's very much reflected in the kinds of solutions we've chosen, lots of wetlands, lots of horizontal levees, that kind of thing. So now I'm going to pass it on to the other members of the group so they can talk about the individual areas.
My name is Jim Casper. I'm from Tam Valley, actually the western part of Tam Valley, so I'm not affected by this directly, but indirectly with a lot of the flooding issues. I'm just going to talk about the area near the Redwoods and the northern part of the map. As Hart mentioned, the emphasis was on minimizing seawalls or significant concrete kind of structures and really looking to retain, if not expand, marshy areas. And so what we talked about was losing some of the parkland that currently exists, but trying to replace it in other areas. In this area here, which is near Goodman's, protecting that the Goodman structure, but also allowing for a marsh to be constructed, doing some living with water in the, I guess it's Shelter Island, and then also putting one place we talked about putting a barrier to protect the highway was right here on the eastern side of 101. I think that's pretty much it. I'll turn it over to Tom.
My name is Tom Nez, and I live in Tam Valley. And our focus here was not to displace too many people in birdland. So because of the creek configuration, basically 3 creeks exiting, we thought we should put a pump station here, and we should do horizontal levees along this area to create more of an estuary and wetland area. We wanted to get rid of the Shoreline Shopping Center, and I'm not sure what this area is right in here, but that also would be eliminated. Holiday Inn, okay. So basically that's our approach. And now I'll turn it over to Sausalito in Marin City.
Marin City. Oh, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Barbara Smith-Cottrell, and I am a Marin City resident. And so, of course, my main focus was on southern Marin, Marin City. If you're not real familiar with our landscape, Marin City is here. It's not just a shopping area, and it's not just the school, our new school, Martin Luther King Jr., which we're really proud of, is high tech. So, having said that, my concern as a resident of Marin City, and quite a number of us, is the fact that we're already looking forward 15 to 20 years. So it's a little hard for me to kind of like coordinate with the rest of my colleagues today because we've already had an experience in 2007 where we were literally cut off. You couldn't get in, we couldn't get out. So the mayor's office last year came to us and presented us with a projected environmental devastation that they're looking at 15 to 20 years from now. So just looking at 6 to 12 inches of water is not a reality for me. I'm already 15 to 20 years ahead. So this gray area here to me is we're already flooded. And for those of you that's not familiar with the Marin City landscape, as a lot of our seniors educated me from day one. They were teenagers and children when they came to Marin City. They have coined it the bowl. And the reason why, if you've ever driven through there or walked through there, the redwoods is the rim. When you get to the shopping center and the area where our school is and our apartments, you have apartments in the redwoods as well. But the majority of us live in the base of that bowl. So we have great concern. Like I said, we've already experienced flooding, but 15 to 20 years from now, you're talking mild hurricanes. It's a reality. It's fearful, but so what my vision is this. I'm eco-friendly. I'm somewhat of an environmentalist, so I thought of the ecosystem as well. But then as an extra precaution, close up, I thought the sea barrier or levee would be a good idea to protect our city. And over here, you have people living on water, which is our boat people. Is that the right reference? And since I'm thinking 15 or 20 years away, I envisioned something that was shown to us. I think they're doing it in Germany. Your houseboats might have to turn to something more permanent. I'm not suggesting that you give up living on water, but if hurricanes are coming, rather than see you totally washed away, you might want to consider that for the future. And back here, since we're anticipating a great deal of flooding with that much velocity and rain and wind, I have gates sitting in the hills so that water passes through. Now, there were suggestions that, well, the gates should be maybe forcing the water back this way, but that's, to me, is making it hard on ourselves. That would be quite a force, with the force coming at you. Now, remember my projection of mild hurricanes. I didn't see that as a reality. So if the water comes through, we let it out. So that's what these gates are, okay? Because I was told this is open space, so open space could always use water. It's going to get water anyway. But so it's rushing in this way, so let it out. So that's the reason for the gates. And I'm thought of our neighbors in Sausalito because they're our next door neighbors except for the hills, and they're really going to get the brunt of whatever happens to us. But keep in mind, Marin City is not flat. And it's easy to forget that when you're looking at a presentation on a flat surface. It's the bowl, okay? The rim, and then you have the middle part, so to speak, but your population is in the base, the bottom. So that's been my focus and my concerns, and please let me know what you think afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara.
Anybody else on number one? I'm Chris Tellis. I live in the Yellow Ferry Harbor houseboat community on Gate 6 Road. So the first part was pretty much a no-brainer, which was to elevate the roads. Gate 6 Road, the Highway 101 exit in Mill Valley, Shoreline Highway going up to Miller Avenue, all those need to be elevated. Actually, they should have been elevated a long time ago. There was a considerable amount of frustration with Caltrans with the fact the last 20 years, this area has been flooded, and it seems that for all of the cones and the special services people have been out there, this could have been done a long time ago, and it cuts off all of Mill Valley's southern exit in this time, and it seems long overdue that these roads have not been elevated. So that's the first part. And then moving along, we felt that in discussions between having a tidal gate and raising the levees along Coyote Creek, that it would be better to, at least in our particular group, felt it would be better to elevate the levees because the ecosystem would be more consistent rather than having a tidal gate in there. You can maintain what's happening in Coyote Creek right now. There was a consensus, primary consensus, that there should be a levee along Shoreline Highway right here, and that the development on the east side would be a retreat. It would revert to marsh, and and that also there would have to be levees built along the other creeks along this area right here to protect the residential areas. There was more of an open discussion about what would happen with these marshes in here, because there is an argument also that as the water level rises, this reverts to open water, and within the Bay Area estuary, a lot of people would prefer open water. So the question is whether or not you let the bay, through the process of sea level rise, have more open water, and because the alternative is to take what's essentially a natural marsh right now and create a man-made marsh that would be fighting against what's happening with sea level rise, which would also require putting in several 100,000 yards of fill in this area. Do you want to really add that amount of fill to create an artificial marsh in this area, or do you want to just let that revert to open water? You could have additional marsh come in, say, where the Mount Tam baseball fields are right now. So as the sea level rises, some of the areas that are in the area that would be within the tidal range where you would have marsh would revert to marsh, and then the areas that would become open water naturally would become open water. So that's an open discussion whether or not you want to try to maintain the existing marsh levels along the shoreline as it is right now, or whether you want that to change. So that's it. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Scott Stender. I live in Tam Valley, Birdland area here. But we talked about quite a few things. I think one of the things that everybody in our group pretty much agreed on was to enhance the marsh that we already have and to expand it as much as possible, and to keep the environmental and wildlife situations as robust as we could possibly do. What we also thought needed to be done was to put in some floodgates that were storm gates, not just always, how do you say this? Not just gates that were always being used on an everyday basis, but only in storm situations, and then later as things progress, then they're there already and can be used in the future for more regular things. But we need them, we felt, on the streams coming down Corte Madera Creek, Coyote Creek, pretty much, and then also at the highway right here. Talking about possibly building up a levee system right at the highway with the floodgates, basically enhancing the bridge that's already there and using it to function as a water flow in and out of the neighborhood area. One of the things that we kind of added, we also added putting a reef system here where it's kind of narrow on the Sausalito side. By the way, Shoreline Shopping Center isn't where this points to. Shoreline Shopping Center is actually way over here. But putting a reef system in so that any big storm surge type stuff that's coming up through the area will have some mitigation for that, so that it'll be dissipated by a little bit of a reef, which will also probably, hopefully, help build up some marshy areas in here as well by having some reef stuff going on. The one other thing that we added to this is we created our own little token here and put a new road right here that goes right behind the Martin Brothers feed area and kind of takes Highway 1 and reroutes it a little bit right there. So the road coming off of Highway 1 then would go behind that shopping center area that's there, and then this would become more of a pedestrian shopping area that would need to be built up a little bit. Let's see, what else did we have here? We talked about putting some additional housing and behind a levee perhaps in this area so that we could build up this area as well for housing and flood control. And we talked about putting some new parks around, but we didn't get very deep in new parks. Kind of felt that once we get a structure to deal with water in place, we could also be addressing some of those other issues. Let's see. So pretty much that's it. As I said again, tidal gates here. Oh, putting a if we put a new road in here, putting a tidal gate on Coyote Creek as well would be, can you all hear me? Yeah. Putting a new tidal gate here on Coyote Creek would also be a good thing, because the biggest concern was that we have a lot of houses in this area, and the cost, well, we didn't really get into cost, and we batted that one back and forth, but to raise all of these homes seems like it would be very expensive to do, and that these would be cheaper ways to deal with that and address the issues as we grow. Okay, and that's it.
Okay, I'm Jen Gennari. It's kind of fun to get to go last. I live over here in Waldo Point Harbor. People in our group were from Marin City, Muir Beach, and Points North and Mill Valley. And we were very concerned with maintaining the natural beauty of the area. And we felt strongly that we should basically learn to live with water. We did think that, given the fact that climate change, one of the problems is driving too much, that it's going to be very key to maintain the bike path. This could be our source of transportation to our stores, and that bike path should be on a dike or a levee, a berm, not a soft one, and that would allow for some of the fish to come through. We were very concerned about the creek here letting the fish come in and out. And so we also thought we should add some beaches. We really liked the examples of what was happening in the Netherlands by adding in sand and hoping that this starts to slow some of the water, the sea level rise coming in here. Again, a lot of adding more wetlands to try to slow the water going that way. We realized that we definitely need a pump in Marin City, as we've heard from quite a number of people here today. And the only other sort of radical thing is imagining that the people here, we couldn't agree on what would happen to birds. This is a very tricky area, but we did think that maybe these people would have to learn to live with water, that maybe they would become floating homes or elevated homes, and that there would have to be, I like this idea of rerouting Route 1, because we knew that would be a problem. And then, again, a few up here to protect. We were concerned about the seniors in the Redwoods, and then a gate here, perhaps. But hoping that a lot of this helps the water slow down its approach into that area. Thank you.
Guys, that was awesome. Kate, bring us home.
So thank you, everyone, so much. These were really fascinating and I think very, very useful comments for all of us, and I really appreciate how engaged everyone in the room got. I'm sort of mindful of everybody's time, so I want to remember to really thank our folks from Community Media Center of Marin, Damien and Scott, who have been filming this event. And they're going to edit the event today and put it on our website. And in addition to that, though, we want to capture all of the hard work that everyone here did today and schedule a larger community meeting for sometime in the first quarter of 2015 to really bring the conversation, the good ideas that all of you had, and expand the conversation to a broader group of our residents so we can carry this forward. I want to make sure that all of you do, I hope, fill out both sides of our form, because this is another alternative to reinforce those good comments that you may have made on stickies on our maps, but on our form in their collection boxes as you leave. So one of the goals that I had in starting this process was that the process that we have gone through as a steering committee, and then all of us have gone through today in looking at these maps and having the kind of conversation that we've had, can be replicated in other areas of our county and become a building block for what will become a really county-wide adaptation planning effort. The county recently has approved funding for a joint adaptation planning, really a vulnerability assessment plan that will be carried out by the cities that are most immediately and obviously vulnerable, potentially vulnerable to sea level rise, and the county. So we can start spreading this conversation, but keep it grassroots oriented. As I started off, I think that's tremendously important and continues to be. We also, coming back on some of the comments of folks of, water does come in all directions. It comes down from our watershed, it comes up from the bay. And our County Department of Public Works has been working on a Southern Marin watershed guide. It's going to be our first watershed guide focused on Southern Marin that will integrate the water coming down from the watershed and the planning that we need to do for sea level rise. So that hopefully will be out and made available quite soon. I've seen a draft. It's a fantastic guide that hopefully will be helpful for all of us. We also have some other things. I think Roger mentioned in his presentation that he's looking for opportunities to do sediment enhancement demonstration projects in areas around the bay. Maybe do some test work on the fortification model, though from this group, I think fortification maybe is out the window and all we're doing is restoring wetlands. But that's clearly not the only comments here. But the other thing I wanted to let you know about, I'm very excited because working with our Parks and Open Space, we have gotten grant money from FEMA to do a really terrific education project. And I'm sure many of you in this room are old enough to remember when there were the viewing binoculars that were at the Golden Gate Bridge Plaza and Coit Tower, and they were in other areas as well. And you could look through them and you could see at a distance, and as a small child, that was a really cool thing to do. Well, time has passed and we've gotten more sophisticated, and there's a wonderful company called Owlized that has taken that idea, changed the shape so it has kind of a friendly looking little owl face, and they're teaming up with Autodesk to program that piece of equipment so that when you look through it, you can see the impact of sea level rise on the vista that you are looking at. And so we've just gotten money from FEMA to have 2 of these owls, and we were out walking the Sausalito Mill Valley bike path the other day trying to figure out where is a good location that really will capture a lot of people to look through and have that education experience. We're hoping that those owls will be out educating all of us by April, but I'm really excited about that. So, and I'm trying to think, if you haven't already made some notes, we had an opportunity coming in about what's important to you. If you didn't have a chance to do that on the way in, I hope that you will do it on the way out. And I think that perhaps, have we done enough for one day? Okay, so thanks again for coming today.